Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society on Wednesday, October 24th, the year 2001, presenting Mr. Leonard Max, who will speak. Stop it.
I hate following him. One of the many now legendary stories of my late father's madcap antics stems from his playing the role of master of ceremonies at a weekend celebration back in those years before the Rideau Centre obliterated the old-time retail store lineup of Freeman's, Astor, Chapeau, Kaplan's, Larocque's, Charles Ogilvie, Ray's, Glenmore, etc. And the daily watering hole for the Jewish merchant princes who owned these stores was the Tea Wagon of fond memory, run by Art Piggott and his wife Jean Morrison Piggott, Jean being one of the still celebrated trio of daughters of Cecil Morrison of Morrison Lamoth Bakeries. And especially in the very early years, in mid-morning, you could usually find gathered round a table in highly irreverent discussion one or more of the Kaplan brothers, Sam and Gordon, the Weinberg brothers, Lloyd and Nordo, Sammy Rayport, Toby Apple, who's here today, Harry Sachs, my dad, to name a few. Now, I wasn't necessarily expecting Mr. Apple here today, but I'm glad to see him. Mr. Apple, as you probably know, was, indeed is, intense, was then chain-smoking, highly successful, and seemingly easily rattled when teased. And my father was a terrible tease. And I'm afraid that it became de rigueur that Mr. Apple was subjected to considerable comic abuse at his hands. And at the weekend celebration in question, attended by most of the old gang, this Tea Wagon crew included, for reasons which now escape me, in his speech congratulating the hosts, my father proceeded one person at a time to relate each of the approximately 30 people in the room to Toby Apple. Now, until then, none of them ever thought they were related to Toby Apple. And the word is that as Dad got down to within 10 people of the end, they were making book by means of side bets like they do at the Reno craps tables, that he couldn't do all 30, but of course he did, albeit in many ways that were so incredibly circuitous and oblique that the crowd was in a state of continual disbelief and hysteria. And I only mention that because it's hard to follow an act like that. And for that reason, among others, I feel totally intimidated by the task at hand. Now, before proceeding further, while we're talking about intimidation, let me tell you how much I admire the effectiveness of the tactics of your society, President Lawrence Freedman, in obtaining speakers. You may recall that in the old days of the British Navy, in the waterfront bars, some poor, unsuspecting itinerant would be invited by some visiting sailors off a ship to have a cup of grog and a flagon with a glass bottom. And upon draining his free drink would discover a gold sovereign at the bottom, concurrent with which he was struck sharply on the noggin with a club, awakening sometime later to find himself the toilet cleaner on a ship which had put out to sea for the next 3 years. Your president, whose late brother Jarvis was one of my close boyhood friends, and who had many complaints to relate about his brother, which are totally irrelevant to the task at hand, makes the old-style naval press gang look like a bunch of crass amateurs. Earlier this summer, innocently at my desk in my law office of a morning with the door closed, I heard the outer door open, muttered conversation, and to the best of my recollection, which may be somewhat skewed even now by shock, what happened next was that Lawrence materialized through the wood of my door like the ghost of Jacob Marley appearing to Ebenezer Scrooge, and pointing a finger at me, intoned in a sepulchral voice, "On September 12th, you will give a speech to the Jewish Historical Society on the history of the Max family. I will return later with further instructions." He then promptly evaporated as ephemerally as he had appeared, leaving me with my mouth hanging open, after which I immediately called my doctor for my annual checkup. Now, a man with this kind of chutzpah is an invaluable resource, and it may be time to consider fitting Lawrence with a bulletproof vest and a gas mask and transporting him to Afghanistan to meet with Osama bin Laden. There are a number of oddities in speaking about the Max family. And the first is, strictly speaking, there is no Max family. The starting point for us is my paternal grandparents, Max Kowalski and Annie Bromberg. And we don't appear to be able to go back of that starting point. Amazingly, for reasons we don't know, it appears that with some exceptions, my grandparents were silent to their own children about their parents or siblings that they had left behind in the old country. Possibly it was too painful. It appears they never saw any surviving parents again after they came over here. Now, my father and my Uncle Arthur both confirmed that they knew little about their grandparents, and except for certain relatives of Annie who appeared to make it to the American side of the border, little about any other relatives who remained back in the old country. Now, from my cousin Evelyn Rivers, about whom more in a moment, comes information which indicates Annie did have one or more siblings in the States. One of their offspring, the late Jack Cooper of Los Angeles, became executive secretary to Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. And Evelyn also advises that in later years, to their considerable amusement, she and Arthur discovered the existence of a hitherto unknown uncle in England who apparently walked in as his wife one day to find her, if we may put it delicately, in flagranti delicto with another gentleman, whereupon he shot the other gentleman, as my late Uncle Sam, Evelyn's father, was wont to say, on the rise. After which he was invited by the English authorities to remove himself from English soil. And mercifully, he then lapses into obscurity. Now, for Max Kowalski, the old country was part of Russia. Possibly, although we are not certain, Grodny. I say Russia because that's where the Cossacks were residing while he was growing into his teens. Historically, on a given day, if the Cossacks weren't there, it could be Poland. For Annie, it was Poland. And somewhere Max met Annie, married her, and like many young Jews of that day seeking to escape anti-Semitism, poverty, and military conscription, by sheer determination, they successfully engineered their way firstly to England and then to Canada. And the first of the children, Rosie Kowalski, mother of my cousins Dr. Morley Goldberg, now a famed semi-retired obstetrician in the Danbury, Connecticut area, and Evelyn, was born in 1904 in Oxford Street in London. Now, we know from Evelyn that Rose came with my grandparents to Canada when she was approximately 2.5 years old, apparently directly to Ottawa. And so that fixes the family's arrival in Canada at possibly 1906 or 1907. Somewhere along the line, Max evolved into a Schneider, a tailor. And after the family's arrival in Ottawa, in succession were born in 1908, Solly Kowalski, father to myself, my brother Mark, and my sister Anne. In 1911, Sarah Kowalski, mother of my cousins Helen Paulo and Jerry's wife, and Mark Dover, Anne Abramson's husband. And in 1917, the baby Arthur Kowalski, father of my cousins Sharon of Toronto and Judy of Victoria. And of those four, and as you are aware, and he's here today, my Uncle Arthur is still with us, 80 plus, and as far as I know, playing at least every other morning one or more sets of tennis doubles. More about him later. Now, as this initial family structure was evolving, my grandfather Max created initially with Sandra Bellman's late father and gradually expanded what came to be a well-known ladies' and men's tailoring shop. At a later stage, he was joined by my father and then Arthur, and this establishment was taken to new levels, encompassing ultimately the fields of wartime military tailoring for the armed forces and furs. However, sometime around the late 20s or early 30s, it appears that my grandfather may have decided that the cost of ordering store signs bearing the name M. Kowalski could be substantially reduced were he to go on a diet with regard to his last name. Whereupon he repaired to the then venerable Ottawa law firm of Beament and Beament, and through Ted Beament, a much revered and now long retired Ottawa lawyer, changed his last name to his first name. Years ago, when Uncle Arthur was applying for his old age pension and had to prove to the authorities that Arthur Max was one and the same as Arthur Kowalski, I had occasion to examine the Ottawa County Court records and locate proof that the court order was made, but no one could locate the court file or an actual copy of the order. Teddy Beament, I believe still with us, now in his late 90s, has a long-time property in the Meech Lake area where I lived up until a couple of years ago. And I met him within the last 2 years at the Chelsea Crossroads and raised this in discussion with him, and he remembered the incident quite clearly. So from that point on, my grandfather became, and in 1939 ultimately died as, Max Max. And in retrospect, for a number of reasons, I've become quite grateful to him for doing that. First, a few years ago, I accidentally came across the lineage of the Russian surname Kowalski and the Polish surname Kowalski. And with no disrespect intended to Nathan, Jack, Dave, Scotty, or Frida, imagine my horror when I discovered that the most common translation of those surnames is the English equivalent of Smith. Saul Max has considerable cachet. Solly Smith, just don't cut it, okay? Second, telling people your grandfather was named Max Max unfailingly produces great comic interest and is a wonderful conversation piece, and in my past and often disreputable personal life, it has on many occasions eased the way into acquaintanceship with various members of the opposite sex, which leads me to third. For reasons which escape me, the singular name of Max appeals to many people. They consider it a fit first name for men and dogs. And in consequence, throughout my adult life, certain of my friends, former lovers and clients, have decided to simply call me Max. And it is a name that I answer to without a second thought. As well, I have recently been informed by one of my favorite clients that she has named her dog after me. So in consequence, although I am not officially named after my grandfather, he has indelibly stamped me with both his monikers. Now, when God told Abraham that he would provide him with descendants as numerous as the grains of sand upon the beach, he wasn't kidding. The Jews in general, and this family in particular, appear to have had very little trouble cleaving unto others and begatting. And that notwithstanding that many years ago, just after the infamous Kinsey report had come out, it was alleged that North American couples had sexual relations something like, on average, 3.8 times a month, at which time the late Harold Pearl, among our family's dear friends, was heard to remark, "Those Goyim were pulling down our average." Which brings us to the fact that in speaking about the Max family, it's not just the Max family at all. It is first the Goldberg family, starting with my Uncle Sam out of New York, Morley and Evelyn's dad, who married Rose. And second, the Dover family out of Eganville, starting with my Uncle Bobby, Helen and Mark's dad, who married Sarah. Now, injecting this particular clan into your family tree is akin to inheriting the Mongolian hordes. They consisted of, and I hope I have this right, 4 brothers and 7 sisters, among them Jake, father of our beloved and now retired surgeon Dr. Big Mark Dover, so called to prevent confusion with his cousin and my own cousin, generally known as Little Mark Dover, Although my cousin Mark would have a hard time today getting away with that adjective. My Uncle Bobby used to describe the annual Eganville Orangeman's Parade to illustrate what it was like for the Dovers growing up in Eganville. Located in Renfrew County, where Jews were otherwise as rare as doukhobors. Now, Eganville has a very pretty and distinctive bridge. And Uncle Bobby said on Orangeman's Day, the Protestants would advance from one side, the Catholics from the other, and the Dover family would be in the middle. He found the length and breadth of his relatives so confusing that he took to referring to them not by name but by occupation. There's me haberdashery brother, me tire cousin, me nuts and bolts cousin, etc. We dare not follow this family line further or we'll be here until next Pesach. Okay. Third, the Paulowan family. This is a family the Maxes are unable to escape, no matter how they may try. They lurk in our genealogical nooks and crannies. We unexpectedly meet them coming around corners. Now, for starts, Uncle Arthur married a very beautiful Hannah Paulowan, mother of Sharon and Judy. And Hannah's sister Debbie married Phil Swedloff, who became one of Arthur's lifelong best friends. Next, my cousin Helen Dover married Jerry Paulowan, youngest brother of, among others, Alex Paulowan, my former counselor at Camp Brith, and the late Dave Paulowan, Betty's husband, father of Jeff, Stephen, and their baby brother, Michael Paulowan. With respect to baby brother Michael, I must now fast forward ahead to introduce you to my daughter, Melanie. Age 39, the second born of myself and my late wife, Mina Kopinski, daughter of the late Nat Kopinski and Faye Toronto. Now, Melanie, after graduating from high school, took a short break of 7 years to run my law office. And during the course of that, she intermittently declared to a number of friends and colleagues in the profession that among the things she was not going to do was marry a Jewish lawyer or go to law school. And it was after that she showed up with the aforesaid Michael Paulowan, undeniably Jewish, and then a law student, and now, today, a partner in the Ottawa office of McCarthy Tetro, which lays claim to being Canada's largest law firm. And it was shortly after that, with not a hint of embarrassment, that she announced she was going to marry. And it was shortly after that she sheepishly but successfully applied to the University of Ottawa Law School with the kind assistance of some of those same colleagues who admired her sterling qualities, ultimately graduating with the gold medal. And it was after that that she and Michael made the late Dave Paulowan and Betty Paulowan and Mina and I grandparents of Jacob, now age 11, and Leah, now age 7, thus guaranteeing, if there was ever any doubt, that the Maxes are doomed to permanent attachment to the Paulowan lineage. Fourth and finally, the Abrams family out of Montreal by way of Romania, which gave us our mother Lillian and a highly lovable and in some cases directly and indirectly distinguished set of Montreal relatives. Now, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, Isidore Pop Abrams, he was always known to us as Pop, and Rose Abrams were particularly important to myself, Mark, and Ann because in practical terms, they were the only grandparents we knew. Max died suddenly in 1939 in his early 50s when I was 3 years old from a condition that today probably would not have killed him. And my grandmother Annie, also in her early 50s, followed him 3 months later, everybody's convinced, from a broken heart. Now, we were barely more knowledgeable about Pop and Grandma Rose's Romanian origins than we are about Max and Annie. This much we know. Pop came from a rural family mired in extreme poverty, involving numerous brothers and sisters. Shoes were an unheard of luxury. In the winter weather, they wrapped their feet in newspapers. His education was minimal. His intelligence was not. He, too, at some stage, evolved into a Schneider. Grandma Rose was the daughter of a cantor. And for those of you and there's many of you here who fall under this category, who either come from or acquired from your own grandparents or parents knowledge of the shtetl, you will know that the rabbis and cantors were the Jewish ruling class. However modest her beginnings, and notwithstanding that her husband came from what I believe she viewed, not without justification, as a peasant class barely a cut above chicken thieves, she always considered and conducted herself like an aristocrat while she was active and in control of her faculties. Now, particularly for these young Jews, Romania was no more of a bargain than Russia or Poland. And these two, initially by separate routes, at the beginning of the last century, found their way into the lower New York City Jewish section, and while both were working in the garment trade, met, married, emigrated into Montreal with very little in their pockets. But with her help, he established himself. From time to time, he was preeminent in the manufacturing and retail side of ladies' wear. He would have been perfectly at home with today's young high-tech entrepreneurs, today instant paper millionaires, tomorrow instant paupers. He made and lost a number of times over what today would be small fortunes without apparently missing a beat. If his lifestyle suffered from the downturns, it didn't often show on the surface. By the time I became aware of them, they were a striking couple. He was a short, bald, somewhat rotund, very pleasant-looking little man, always extremely dapper and well-turned out, generous to a complete fault. She was a tall, regal-looking, handsome woman, always beautifully coiffed and dressed, albeit quite reserved. His nose came up to her very substantial bosom. Substantial female bosoms being a female family trait, I might add, that has, without exception, distinguished both the Max and Abrams lines of female descendancy, and a trait, I might add, that is a minimum qualification for any prospective companion for a Max male. Together in their heyday, he looked a little like a somewhat foreshortened Diamond Jim Brady who had gone respectable by marrying into the blue blood. Now, they produced 4 children in order: my mother Lillian, my uncle Bill Abrams of Montreal, my aunt Anne Begg of Montreal, and my late uncle High, who was killed over England during World War II while flying with the RCAF. Both girls were and remain to this day very beautiful. Both boys were extremely handsome, particularly High, who apparently had the charm and, like his father, the chutzpah of a Mississippi River gambler, and had to beat prospective girlfriends off with a stick. Now, everyone blamed my grandfather for unwittingly putting a curse on my mother, which led to her marrying my father. By the time she had reached her late teens, she was absolutely stunning. An accomplished pianist approaching the level of concert performance and modeling the very beautiful gowns my grandfather manufactured. By this same time, my father was approaching his mid-20s. I do not think any of us would describe him as absolutely stunning. If he were here today now, he'd rear back and say, "That's just a rotten thing to say to me," okay? His mid-20 pictures bear a resemblance to an emaciated version of Charlie Chaplin. He did, however, as you well know, possess what, by way of understatement, can be called a sense of humor and a sense of the ridiculous, both of which were just this side short of insane. And by now he had joined his father in the Ottawa store, as did Arthur later, and he was buying out of Montreal, which is where Pop first saw him, and Daddy first met Mummy. And after that first meeting, and this is apparently true, Pop turned to Mummy and told her, "That's just the kind of nice young man that you should marry." I do not believe my mother was impressed. Since age 12, she had been going out with college boys, and she had prospective suitors beating down the doors. Daddy, however, had decided that more frequent Montreal buying trips were necessary for the benefit of the establishment of M. Max. When I was about 7 years old, in the course of rooting around in their clothes cupboard, I quite accidentally came across a box full of love letters, mainly from my father to my mother, exchanged between them while they were becoming engaged. And after removing all the stamps off the envelopes for my then stamp collection, I proceeded to read them. Would that I had also completely saved them, because I do not know after that where they went, and that's something I regret to this day. You will not be surprised to hear that my father was an extremely engaging and funny correspondent, nor that during the courtship he totaled my mother's yellow convertible while it was on loan to him for driving Montreal to Ottawa and back. The story of their ensuing courtship would require another good hour in the talents of the Marx brothers. Suffice it to say that whether by design or otherwise, he managed to encounter her at a Montreal hotel tea dance. And when she refused to dance with him, he proceeded to dance alone without a partner beside her and her then partner, and badger her until, to avoid the sheer embarrassment he was inflicting upon her, she agreed to dance with him. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, over the violent objections of my Uncle Bill, ultimately Daddy's lifelong friend, mainly by reason of the fact that Mummy was all of 19 years old, she was married in Montreal to Daddy, age 25, at, I believe, the Mount Royal Hotel, Windsor. And the Ottawa side of the wedding procession came down to Montreal in a specially chartered train, completely full, that is rumored to have floated off the tracks a number of times due to the puddles of excess scotch and rye. One of Dad's groomsmen was the late Mo Sloan, who married Lil Sloan, and whose late son Richard became my sister Anne's husband, father of Stacy Cantor, who with her husband Mark Cantor has this year given Danny and Bev Cantor their second, and my sister Anne her first grandchild, Jonah, now age approximately 6 months, 6 feet, 240 pounds, and in the footsteps of his uncle Noah, optioned to play for the British Columbia Lions when he reaches age 7.5. My Uncle Bill Abrams later married Jeanette Heilig, and Mr. Heilig was for years firstly president and then later president emeritus of Montreal's venerable Shar Shemayim Synagogue. And Bill himself, a lawyer who graduated during the Depression but never practiced, and who went into the garment trade with Pop, concurrently became, and has remained throughout his lifetime into his present 80s, extremely active in Canadian Jewish national affairs, particularly with the Canadian Jewish Congress, as well as a prolific writer on related intellectual and philosophical issues. Among the 3 cousins given to us by Bill and Jeanette, Judy, David, and Bob, my cousin Bob is a partner in the Montreal law firm started by Laz Phillips Weinberg, now a worldwide entity. My Auntie Anne married Bill Begg, one of the first professional marketing consultants in the fashion trade to operate out of Canadian offices. They had 2 children, our cousins Barbie and Hank, both of whom are now living in the States. Barbie is a professor and Hank is a scientist technologist. Pop ultimately died in his 70s, just before Mayan and I could tell him that his first great-grandchild was on its way. Grandma Rose died at age 99. Now, before leaving the levels of the initial founding families, there are 3 interwoven anecdotal themes on which I want to touch. Music is the first. Apparently, Grandpa Max had a magnificent voice. He was also a bit of a bum when it came to attending school. And in the old days in Russia, there were a number of renowned cantors who gathered round them choirs and toured. And like NHL hockey coaches, they were always on the lookout for fresh talent. And one of these cantors was apparently walking in a park with his entourage of a day when my teenage grandfather and some friends, shoes around their neck, barefoot, playing hooky and singing at the top of their voices, came by, whereupon he picked off my grandfather for his choir. Daddy said that in the old King Edward Avenue synagogue, Grandpa Max used to rattle the timbers during the high holy days. Now, my father, as you probably know, studied violin, played in the Lisgar Orchestra while he was in high school, in his later teens, played weekends with his band named Molly Sax and his Orchestra to hide from his mother the fact that he was playing in local roadhouses. Played in the old Ottawa Symphony, which was the forerunner to the present NAC Orchestra. After the formation of the NAC Orchestra, played with the reconstituted local Ottawa Symphony into his 80s. My parents were intimately involved with the old Ottawa Symphony, which was powered by the leadership of their very good friend, the late Lawrence Freeman, father of Margot and AJ. Not in small part because the then and for some considerable time conductor of the old orchestra was one of our closest family friends, Eugene Cash, otherwise known to us as Jack. And Jack was both a conductor and violinist of national reputation. His efforts led toward the founding of the first youth orchestra. He was a compelling personality and one hell of a ladies' man until his wings were clipped by a very beautiful young singer who we first met in the living room of our home, named Maureen Forrester. And they ultimately married and moved to Toronto and proceeded to give birth to a small dynasty of their own, the children from whom are now well-known North American media and entertainment personalities in their own right. Ultimately, also in part because my father kept donating back to the symphony his paycheck every time he played a concert, my parents were made honorary patrons of the orchestra. Now, as we have seen, Grandma Rose's father was a cantor, and my mother at age 19, before my father, as we were fond of saying, ruined her career, was a pianist, just sort of concert performance quality. Mark and Ann and I grew up with violin and piano duets and regular living room sing-songs. As you may know, Mark, together with Russell Cronick and initially Kayla Mursky, now Balin, with the backing of encouragement of Harvey Glatt, formed the folk singing group The Couriers, and they performed throughout Canada and the United States, including Greenwich Village. During that time, meeting and much admired by colleagues in the entertainment field, including the Clancy brothers and the then much younger Bill Cosby. Because of Mark's health and Russell's family obligations, the boys resigned at the last moment from permanently pursuing professional careers through the group. But those of you who have attended some of their local revival performances in recent years in aid of charitable causes will know that they are still capable of bringing down the house. And Mark's son, my nephew Josh, usually noted for his quiet reserve, possesses extraordinary instrumental and vocal musical talents, and together with a very engaging and likewise talented partner, is presently, indeed even now as I stand, I understand, performing locally. Sister Ann has considerable musical talents, most of the time, she tries to hide under a bushel. My main contribution to the musical theme was that at age 18, for one summer, I brought Leonard Cohen, then president of my McGill fraternity, but already famed as a college musician and writer, to Camp in Brith. And for 7 weeks we had him leading our sing-songs. He was a close colleague of Pete Seeger and inherited some of his approach, and those were 7 real good sing-song weeks. Theme 2, Uncle Arthur. Dad and Uncle Arthur ran the store as partners through World War II. And Arthur was a designer, and during and immediately following the war was consultant to the 3 services regarding the designing of new uniforms. 2 stories, among others, came out of this. First, from scratch, he had to develop a special white nylon coverall for a special division being posted to the north, suitable to 60 degrees below. And when he got the specifications, there was no provision for a fly to enable relief for one of the major functions. And Arthur phoned the liaison officer and said, "You've got no fly in these pants." And the liaison officer said, "That's right." And Arthur said, "What if he has to go? He just goes." And the liaison officer said, "Yes. Otherwise, if he opens up that uniform at 60 degrees below, it's going to be instant freeze." Second, at the conclusion of this project, Arthur received a letter from Lord Mountbatten, then head of the British Navy, saying that he loved the changes and was recommending them to the British Navy. at which the liaison officer said that Lord Nelson must be spinning in his grave to think that Lord Mountbatten would change a uniform that was probably designed in the days of Cromwell. Third short theme, Aunts Rose and Sarah and today's high-tech computers. I am told that current computer technology can transmit a change of news around the world in approximately 30 seconds. I am not impressed. Back in the 40s, my aunties Rose and Sarah, using a single telephone operator, would have transmitted that change of news before the computer operator even got to her seat to start punching her keys. Let me finally take you in machine gun fashion into the present day. I've already given you background regarding my sister Anne and her daughter, my niece Stacy. Anne's first husband, Richard Sloan, died at far too early an age. She later married my then law student, Leonard Levencrown, now a prominent local lawyer, which gave rise to Stacy's sister and my delightful niece, Mandy, now pursuing postgraduate studies at Dalhousie University in Halifax in the rather peculiarly combined fields of biology and theatre. Brother Mark married Anne's best friend, Yanda Weiser. I have earlier told you that involving the Dover and Pullowan families in the genealogy produces a real traffic jam. That is but a mere bagatelle in comparison to the Weiser connection, because that meant really that Mark married the whole Pollock family, and the Pollock family trumps all other families. Years ago, there was a comic hit song titled, "I'm My Own Grandpa," in which the singer ultimately leads us to the conclusion that by a series of truly cockamamie intermarriages, he has succeeded in becoming his own grandfather. Cockamamie he may have been, but not so cockamamie as Yanda's family. I will leave it to Yanda and another day to fully relate the story of how, at a local commercial institution, after she met and tried to explain to an elderly family acquaintance who met her there that Yanda's mother Geedy had married her Uncle Eddie, thus making Yanda's uncle her stepfather, and Eddie's children, Yanda's cousin, her stepsisters, and the woman clutched her head and ran from the place going, "Oi, mama!" Okay. From Mark and Yanda came Nomi, my brilliant niece with an MA from Johns Hopkins, who married into the New Jersey family of Harold Colton, likewise brilliant. They are living in Brooklyn, New York, with one young grandson named Zach, known to both sets of grandparents, and to his Uncle Josh as the Prince. Finally, I first married Mina Kopinski, whose background in part I have earlier described. And her father, Knapp, who died not that long ago and was a wonderful grandfather to our 4 children, was himself one of 9 brothers, sons of the late Max Kopinski, Ottawa's first Jewish policeman, who himself died young, leaving his wife, Debbie Kopinski, to raise all 9 boys on her own, which she did, reigning as an adored matriarch well into her old age. And among those boys was Ben Karp, a name beloved to this synagogue, about which more in a moment. Now, Mina's mother was Faye Toronto, and Faye's father was Joe, a skilled metal craftsman with hands like ham hocks, who was part of the crew that put the original copper roofs on the Parliament buildings and the Château Laurier. That Toronto family had and still has, I think Harry is still alive, exceptional longevity, and at no age were or are any of them to be messed with. In his 90s, when Joe was staying at the old Hillel Lodge on Wurtemberg and crossing the park across the street every afternoon to go to Mincha at the Beth Sholem in the Old Chapel Street Community Center, a young fella tried to hold him up, and Joe looked at him, and he gave him such a clup across the head that the guy turned tail and ran away immediately. Now, from Mina and I came Sean, age 40, a Queen's graduate, our Peter Pan. After an earlier stint in Italy teaching English as a second language, he is this month newly arrived in Prague in the Czech Republic on a new assignment. Then came Melanie, now Paulwyn, whose provenance I have already described. Then son Kerry, age 34, whose CV includes Canada World Youth via Newfoundland and Sri Lanka after Gloucester High School, a period of world travel and work, a degree from the Scarborough School of International Development, followed by a Commonwealth scholarship to Oxford in England to obtain a Master's in International Economics. He presently works for CETA, and he is married to Melissa McLean, a woman of equal academic brilliance and superior disposition. Presently completing her PhD after taking time off to give birth to Benjamin, age 3, who is the namesake of the Max children's favorite Uncle Ben Carp, and Nathan, age 5 months. And last in the first family is daughter Jody, who just turned age 31, a graduate of the McGill School of Social Work, presently living and working in the American Midwest. Now, I married a second time to Debbie Edwards, and we have 2 daughters. Meg, age 17, a writer in her last year at Canterbury High School, who last month won awards from Carleton University for her poetry and prose, and Lissy, age 12, a budding actress who has recently finished a 2-week stint in a play which was publicly performed and put on by Lissy's drama teacher, presently in grade 7 at my old high school of Fisher Park. Meg and Lissy's maternal grandmother, Ginny Edwards, is American-born and traces her ancestry through the Mayflower into England and Scotland. Their maternal grandfather, Dr. Albert Edwards, a retired vice president of Alcan, through a French-Canadian grandmother, traces his ancestry to the accountant that Samuel de Champlain brought with him on his first voyage to assist him in governing the New World colony in Quebec. Essentially, it's been 100 years, give or take a few, and I'm barely scratching the surface. I think I could probably speak for my brother and sister when I tell you that if God had given us an advance choice prior to being born, we couldn't have chosen a more lovable, loving, accomplished, and wacky family than fell to be our lot. And living through my own part of this genealogy has been both fascinating and astounding. For a Jewish boy, it's a very long and strange way from 2 barefoot grandfathers in Russia and Romania to 2 young daughters who trace themselves to the Mayflower and Samuel de Champlain. I can't wait to see what happens over the next 100 years. Thank you.
Questions from the floor?
Lawrence, I would just like to point out one thing. Out of everything that Leonard said, it may be easy for him to say that Max was okay? But when you're born and you're told by your father afterwards that my mother and my grandmother were in session for 7 days, or 7 hours, whatever it was, and he finally came to them and said, look, you have 2 choices, Max or Mark Max. And that's how I now get to be Mark Max, which everyone in the entire world confuses, and I'm either called Mark or Max or Mark or whatever. My wife can tell you stories when we used to call each other long distance and go through French-Canadian operators who never got it right, that it is not so good to be Max. Glenn Max may be all right, but Max after does not follow so easily.
Any other questions? Or anecdotes or stories? I'll ask Milton Schaefer to come forward then.
Thank you. Leonard, you're one of a kind. One of a kind. If I had known that I was going to be asked to do this, I would have prepared. Thanks to our chairman here and our president, this is completely surprising to me. Just one comment on all this long thing about the Max family is that Leonard forgot to put in his remarks. A very, very big factor of his dad, Saul. He was very instrumental in the Ottawa Kiwanis Club. And he used to put on a performance every Friday luncheon at the Chateau Laurier. And big thing, eh? And they were asked to put on a show at the Madison Square Gardens in New York City for the International Kiwanis clubs. And he was instrumental in putting on the musical performance for the International Kiwanis Club at Madison Square Gardens in New York City. And I think that is a great thing that happened. And then he involved his sons, Mark and Leonard, into the group, and they had a hell of a good time. When, even though you forgot to mention that, Leonard, we want to thank you very, very much. It must have taken a lot of research to go way back to Samuel D. Champlain.
Thank you. Let me just say something to you for a couple of minutes. I didn't forget, of course, to mention that in the course of preparing these remarks. And you know, you don't think much about your background in terms of sitting down and starting to trace this. Michael, my son-in-law, has done this for the podcast. I could deliver, Mark could deliver, Anne could deliver another set of 4-hour talks on my father, anecdotes and whatnot. And I was quite deliberate in not doing that because I wanted to give you some idea of, which you already know, I'm sure, from your own families, but what the hell can happen from 4 grandparents coming over whose backgrounds we can't get into. And you're up here 100 years later and you're saying, my God, they're all over the place. They're like ants. They're through the whole earth. I will, however, just pad out Milton's anecdote about Madison Square Garden. Because it's something that we've held close for years. Dad had originated and run what was known as the Musical Committee in the Central Ottawa Kiwanis. Yeah, and it became, can you hear me okay now? And it became quite famous. Among other things, he initiated singing commercials for various people who'd have to pay money for them during the luncheons. And then they were asked to entertain for regional conventions. And finally, this invitation came to come down and entertain at the Kiwanis International Convention in New York City. These things, if you aren't members of Kiwanis, if you are, you know what I'm talking about, they're huge. People come from all over the world. And Daddy, of course, along with help from others, wrote out scripts for skits with music stolen from all over the place and enlisted all kinds of people, including some very strange performers from time to time. And he did co-opt Mark and I to come down, and this was quite an excursion. We went down to New York in heat, which was 110 degrees. There was a taxi strike. We had to walk. Water was rationed. And they put us up, however, at the old Waldorf Astoria. Frank Sinatra was staying next door. This was a gorgeous hotel. But there were events planned for every night for entertainment for families at the convention at Madison Square Garden, which is where we had to put on this play. And what turned out was, we were about 3 or 4 days, I think, from performing it. And when they went to make arrangements to get in there, they said the only thing you can do is we're going to have to wait till all of the evening entertainment over, and you're going to have to come down and rehearse right at the end of the evening. It could be in the 11 to 12 hour. And they said, technically the stagehands are sort of overtime from by then, but we'll see what we can do. And the first night we went down, apparently there was a couple of very reluctant stagehands down there who stayed by, watched the rehearsal. At the end of the first night of rehearsal, said to my dad, Mr. Max, don't you worry, we'll have here all the people you need from here on in. The night before we performed, the comedian Alan King was brought in to perform for the people in the same arena we were to perform in. The place was absolutely jammed to the rafters. He was absolutely hysterical. And it was a wonderful evening of entertainment. And we were absolutely sick. Okay. We're pretty nervous to begin with because this was a big thing. When the night finally came, and I guarantee you this was like nothing they saw in Kiwanis, because it's sort of a homegrown skit kind of thing. The closest thing, I guess, you could get to it would have been the old Wayne and Schuster type of productions. And without going too much into what happened, we were placed in such a way that I think we were sort of the cleanup act before the formal part of the evening finally sort of would bring things to a close. And we put on this performance, and of course things like that are a blur when you do it. And we came to the end of it, and it was a very funny, and we were getting laughs throughout, tremendous reaction, and there was a moment's silence, and the whole place stood up and gave Daddy a standing ovation. And I don't think I have ever had another experience like that in my life. I don't think I'll ever forget it as long as I live. I'm sure Mark won't, or any of us who were down there. But it was a great experience, and it was one of the high points of his life. And thank you very much for your attentiveness tonight. It's a pleasure to see you.